right, let's state the obvious. There's something wrong with me.
War. War never changes. Except in Fallout's case, when it did multiple times. The Fallout fanbase has been at war with itself since before Fallout 3 even came out. Interplay put out Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel in a separate game titled just Brotherhood of Steel. If those two titles sound confusing, that's because they are. People were already very discontent with the change from the post-apocalyptic role-playing game, the classic RPG, to other formats, well before Fallout was sold to Bethesda, who did their own thing with it, giving some of the Black Isle Studios creators a chance to get back to Fallout in New Vegas. Before that game was entirely ignored by Bethesda again, doing their own thing in Fallout 4. Outsourced to other BGS studios for 76, and finally made into a TV show. I talked about Bethesda's generational cycle in a previous video. I'll try to have it linked below, but to sum up one specific part in an abridged format, fans of classic role-playing games were not pleased with newer formats, wishing for games that were either better written or played more like the games they wanted. Contrary to popular opinion, people who don't like something don't always dislike it for the same reasons, and haters of modern Fallout do so for a variety. But from Daggerfall to Morrowind saw massive changes in the Elder Scrolls. From Morrowind to Oblivion saw even more. And from Oblivion to Skyrim threw the baby out with the bathwater when it came to simulating RPG elements. Most people who hopped into a certain generation felt ignored or even slighted by what came later. That's why games like The Elder Scrolls Online do callbacks to Morrowind or Oblivion every few years to try to recapture those players who had dropped off, noting that those recaptured players typically don't stay. They tend to drop off again until the next callback brings them back to the game. It's the power of marketing. So while I personally believe mechanical elements need to be the stars of the show in an interactive medium like video games, people have made it very clear, at least in the Bethesda space, that story and characters are very important to them. I've often said that the open world is the actual main character in a Bethesda Game Studios Maryland produced game, because the first thing many players recount is just going off in a particular direction and discovering something. The number of people who proudly state that they have never completed the main quest in a Bethesda game is a worrying statistic for those who value storytelling, characters, things of that nature. So you had people who jumped into the Fallout series at 3, and that became their baseline of what they loved about Fallout. But oddly enough, from there was a large portion of people who did start at Fallout 3, but then looked at New Vegas when it released and decided New Vegas was their new baseline. New Vegas is not a perfect game and suffers from being rushed in several aspects. Chief among them are areas and quest lines that look very interesting and were clearly planned to be more than they were, but are instead dead ends, either literally or figuratively. Still, New Vegas attempts things that defy modern Bethesda's design principles. Biggest among them was the attention to world building, not to be confused with the concept of world design. World design, also known as level design, in concert with narrative, characters, items, and basically everything else in the setting, contributes to world building. But it's very possible to have world design or level design without world building. The closest Bethesda game to Fallout New Vegas is actually Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, where an attention to detail was put into ensuring the main quest informed the various factions in the game world, at least to a small degree. Relationships that Morrowind plays around with, such as the Fighters Guild or the Thieves Guild rivalries, are better defined in Fallout New Vegas's form, where the factions insist on spying on one another and ultimately either allying or exterminating each other. While Bethesda seems to want to compartmentalize its factions into easily designable bubbles, mostly separate from the main quest, with only a little bit of crossover, Fallout New Vegas encourages you to interact with each faction differently in each playthrough. as a byproduct of the main quest, not just an ending sort of way that Fallout 4 does. Honestly, Fallout New Vegas does things that Morrowind developers would never have attempted, and that's part of why the game is so beloved right now. New Vegas creates the illusion that the NCR and Caesar's Legion are infinitely larger than what is expressed in-game. The battle for Hoover Dam being a sort of advanced vanguard of both forces, with the real bulk of their forces to come later. The idea that either army could, any week now, march into the Mojave and completely change the face of it. That looming threat exists in the story, but isn't feasible to put in-game. But the way they designed the game, players can look over Bunker's Hill, where Caesar is, at the tents in the distance, and it does paint a picture of a massive army lying in wait. Likewise, the NCR was implied to be a massive beast of a nation living in comparative safety to the wild wastelands of the Mojave. When you traveled in Novigrad in The Witcher 3, the developers had the presence of mind to lock off locations to you in the interest of giving the developers the space to create more open world relevant locations without compromising the illusion of the world's scale. The interiors of many locations in Novigrad simply aren't plot relevant, and trying to recreate all of them would have drained developer resources and caused them to have spent way too much time on something that wasn't very consequential to the act of being a Witcher. And so there are simply locations the player cannot visit. And players of a Bethesda game might see this as a weakness. Oh, hey, I want to be able to go into every single building. But it's because not all buildings are enterable that so many buildings can exist. It's why Starfield, having buildings you can't enter and the cities being extremely small at the same time, feels a little off. Hey, anyone listening to this right now, if you've played a lot of RPGs, or a lot of games in general, can you think of any particular games where they have a massive sprawling city, but the player can only access a certain portion of it? And can you think of any specific games where that has actually contributed to the sense of scale that the game has? I can think of a few that have done this, and I'm considering making a video about it. So the question is, what are the best ones that you've seen? Leave a comment below. Anyway, back to the concept of the illusion. Bethesda isn't interested in maintaining the illusion of world size in their games. Sure, we may get some references to things that happen in other locations, and like the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion in Skyrim. That's under the reasonably maligned tell don't show, couple red guards in Whiterun having a little drama. Bethesda tries to have everything in-game and physically explorable, and while that's led them to having some of the more memorable and interesting sandboxes in gaming, it is constantly at the expense of the scope and scale of the setting, although there might be engine limitations and other problems also holding back scope and scale. So there's likely much more than just one reason why things turn out the way they do. Unlike most of the vocal minority, I'm not blanket saying that Morrowind or New Vegas are 100% better than the more modern Skyrim or Fallout 4 as video games. While there are elements of Skyrim or Fallout 4 that are certainly inferior, I enjoy them for different reasons. More rooted in exploration of the sandbox and the dungeon crawling experience you can't get anywhere else at the moment. I mean, Morrowind's dungeons are practically non-existent, and Fallout New Vegas only really gets good dungeons as of the DLCs, like the Sierra Madre, the Great Divide. Those are dungeons unto themselves, and of course, Old World Blues is a giant hub of dungeons. But I was just more or less talking about the base game. Anyway, there's a reason why unreleased indie projects like Ardenfall and titles like Dread Delusion are getting renewed attention when Starfield has kind of failed to deliver the very specific experience that people want from a Bethesda sandbox. The demand for it is growing, and the indie space is moving to fill the gap. A lot of people want that Bethesda sandbox. It's the particulars surrounding the sandbox that people, myself included, quibble over. Now, what is a detail for me to complain about briefly, then resume enjoying the game, might be a complete showstopper for somebody else. They might hate the game for something that for me is a minor inconvenience. And from my perspective, I'd say that's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, we all like different things. The cost of being individuals. So that brings us to our first Fallout TV show stop. I hope you didn't think this video was going to be a review of the Fallout TV show, because I have no interest in nitpicking the lore inconsistencies in a Transmedia franchise. For those who are unaware, a Transmedia franchise is an elaborate marketing campaign where media is created in multiple formats. And in order to get the entire story, the consumer is expected to consume multiple media forms and buy multiple products along the way. Warcraft is the most famous Transmedia franchise, where you have the initial games having their continuity overwritten by novels and graphic novels in order to push sales. The latest thing must always be canon, and special attention will be done to, if not completely overwrite things about the setting, then provide very important context that completely changes how one views certain elements or characters within that setting. Now, if these settings were being conducted as an artistic endeavor, first and foremost, a Transmedia franchise has the potential to be amazing for storytelling. The best places I've seen a Transmedia franchise work are when a television series is canceled and then is finished in the form of either novelizations or audio dramas. Then I see the adaptation as added value, provided the novels or audio dramas are, of course, respectful to the source material in a true continuation, because those can be done on a much, much lower budget than a television show. And so if a show is canceled, it is still possible for creators to fund the smaller projects. However, this is important. A certain amount of reverence really has to be lent to an adaptation for them to resonate with fans and not come off as cynical. Unfortunately, Fallout 3, 4, and 76 already feel cynical to the fans of Fallout 1 in New Vegas. This isn't intentional, this is just the result of telling our own story within the setting. A developer of Fallout 3 was once quoted, and good luck sourcing that, by the way, as saying, "This setting is so wacky, we can do whatever we want." End quote. Much to the horror of classic fans at the time. That quote resonated through various forums, and I've had zero luck tracking it back, but it does sound like something but modern Bethesda would say, or at least it matches up with their actions, especially when you heard Pete Hines talk publicly about Fallout. It very much matches his attitude. Now it's important to understand that Pete Hines was a director of publishing and public relations, so it was his job to talk to outlets, not individual people, and he made some mistakes talking to individual people along the way. That's a community manager's job. Bethesda had world-class community managers in its various locations before they started getting laid off. But it's important to understand that Pete Hines was not a game developer. And so, while his attitudes may be reflective of the developers, they were, at the end of the day, strictly from a man who was supposed to be doing PR. Now, if we want a more nuanced take on a Transmedia franchise, let's look at Star Wars. It had extremely high-quality stories, many of them, that were not fit for the big screen, and found high-quality releases by authors contracted by LucasArts. Now, I can say a whole ton of negative things about George Lucas, but that doesn't change the fact that he was the creator and simultaneously the creative in charge of Star Wars. He took an active interest in LucasArts projects. Now, he didn't agree with a lot of what happened in the EU on a creative level. For example, he didn't like Luke getting married or the Emperor getting cloned. But he also didn't object to their existence as a part of the EU or expanded universe, because that was not his creation. The goal of the EU is always to ensure that there was Star Wars material that was fun and exciting. His words, not necessarily to attach any sort of canon to it. I personally love quite a few of the EU stories, but that didn't change the fact that, contrary to what anyone else may say on the matter, George Lucas did not consider those stories his own. That's why the prequels and Clone Wars series went on to contradict so much of the early EU. The EU was treated as soft canon, or canon to itself, but not to the core series, except when the core series needed to grab material, which occasionally it did. And under Disney, it definitely did. See, people in sales and marketing found that if you eliminate the concept of soft canon and push hard the idea that every new piece of media is important, consumers are more encouraged to consume all of it. That bolsters sales. Leaving cash on the table isn't just a sin, it goes against the responsibilities that an officer in a corporation has to its shareholders. When Disney bought Star Wars, the intellectual property, you can see that transition from soft canon to not leaving cash on the table. In other words, all the old material are now legends, and we are going to have hard canon to ensure that people pay attention and purchase everything. For all of George Lucas's faults, he wanted the EU to be fun and exciting. Disney is producing a product that they need to sell you above all other things. Likewise, Bethesda uses canon not as an artistic narrative tool to ensure excellence in storytelling in line with the creator's vision, but rather as a cudgel to extract as many sales as possible. You can see how each Elder Scrolls game is more or less its own bubble universe as it was created at the time, with each new entry radically changing the setting depending on the game they wanted to make. Tamriel isn't a living, breathing world, but a set of performance pieces put on for the player's benefit. Usually, if the source material stands on its own, they don't have to make appeals to canon, but because canon is being used as a marketing driver, the latest product must be stated to be canon, a la The Elder Scrolls Online, a la the Fallout TV show. If you aren't a Marvel MCU tourist and an actual fan of comic books, then the illusion of cohesive canon has long since left you. Each artist, more or less, spins their own take on the franchise, choosing to reference or not reference earlier artists' work as they see fit. And to be absolutely clear, this isn't a new change in the industry due to a newer generation of comic book artists. This is how the American comic book industry has been for decades, more or less since its inception. If you are an active player of tabletop role-playing games, then you know the prevalence of homebrew, either as a setting completely from scratch, or more commonly, modifying aspects of modules to make them better fit your party's players, existing characters, or adventures you've already done. We'll be discussing homebrew in another video, but it bears mention here now. My wife is a huge fan of Japanese cartoons, and consequently I talk about them more than the landlocked European historical realism fans would like. Anyway, if you go back to the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s, it wasn't uncommon for a series of Japanese cartoons to be split between a TV series and an OVA series, original video animation, or original animated video, OAV. Point is, same characters, same world, different timeline of events. You watch enough of those, you get used to the fact that there are split canons, stories that stand on their own. One of my favorite 2D side-scrolling platformer series of games, Gunvolt, which is a spiritual successor to the Mega Man Zero and ZX series made by the same creators, who are ranging from 2014 to 2022, actually has a split timeline of games. The first game, there's a bad ending where the main character dies. It then pivots to the minor villain turned anti-hero for a spin-off series called Avenger X, the main character being the Avenger of Gunvolt. The good ending takes you into Gunvolts 2 and 3. Now, I may be tempted to say, well, then X isn't canon. Well, actually, X has a sequel called X2. In other words, it has its own separate canon, its own continuity that goes in a different direction following a different character. An alternate timeline, so to speak, something that is extremely common in comic books. There is no true canon. Rather, each cluster of works has its own soft canon, which it may or may not choose to reference at times. Now, going all the way back to Sherlock Holmes, one of my favorite book series growing up, it has been reimagined, recreated many times in movies and TV shows. He's usually a loser compared to the source material, by the way. There's even a cartoon called Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. In short, I learned way before the majority of people complaining about the Fallout TV show to disregard spin-offs, reimaginings, and adaptations as in any way being able to ruin the source material. It's a lot more healthy to compartmentalize them as their own thing, separate. Now, that said, canon is great for having a shared base of knowledge when discussing future directions authors can take material. The only problem is in franchises where there is no clear authorial intent, but rather a drive by a revolving door of creatives to reinvent parts of the story within each iteration, that's when you should stop paying attention to them as a canon. People confuse a revolving door of creators with being a living story. A living story is when an author's in the middle of a series of novels and hasn't reached their natural conclusion yet. No author is perfect, and even someone as famous as Stephen King really wants to rewrite some of his earlier work, most prominently in the Dark Tower series. Good series, by the way. But at that point, you can view the intentions of the author, a single creative vision guiding the series. When the series are passed off from creative to creative, it stops being a living work in the way that a single creative mind is driving it. Rather, every single entry in that series gains equal importance, as two products created by two separate minds may contradict each other. Society has been more or less programmed through marketing and shills that the one with legal custodial rights to the intellectual property should be able to overwrite the previous one. That's full of crap. Both works exist concurrently as testaments to the vision of each creator, each individual person. Companies are not your friends. You should view companies with an adversarial point of view. Try your best to identify the creators behind the work, because that is the human mind that is driving the art. So in the social space that we consume media, canon is a social construct between the creative and the reader, viewer, or player. Mega corporations and their marketing firms only care about what they can sell you and will argue passionately through sock puppet accounts that canon is an absolute. But their products are not the Bible. They do not dictate the destination of your immortal soul, should you be faithful. Brands should not be your religion. They are merely custodians to an intellectual property as a legal concept. There is a genuine reason why some countries have enshrined what are referred to as moral rights, existing above intellectual property rights as law, to grant creators control over their works that supersede contract law in order to render it impossible for a creative to completely, totally, and permanently surrender their rights to their creations. Activision Blizzard, even before getting acquired by Microsoft, had been writing increasingly complex legalese into their user in-license agreements to try to strip you of any agency should you live in one of those countries that enjoy moral rights. In other words, they are actively telling you to give up your moral rights as a part of the contract to use this software, something that is illegal in those countries. But they're trying anyway because they really don't want you to own what you make. Now, since Blizzard is part of Microsoft now, I'd expect this problem to get worse. We live in a cyberpunk dystopia now, with Microsoft as one of the prime megacorps of the setting. It's just not the cool kind of cyberpunk, sadly. It's just me with pink cat ears. Although Elongated Muskrat is spearheading the brain-hacking implant chips for true mind control. So give it another few generations and we'll have that dystopia nailed down. But back to my earlier point, companies are not unknowable monoliths. The products they do make as creative endeavors are the products of the minds of human beings. and it's okay to give preference to some over others, as any consumer of art has the right to do. You, the reader, viewer, or player, are not required to play by the social rules set down by the public consensus, shaped as it is by marketing titans and obnoxious fandoms. If anyone tells you otherwise, then they're an angry person on the internet who's trying to tell you how to have fun with your game. I should know. I'm one of those angry people on the internet. I support intellectual property canon as a common shared base of knowledge to work off of, after all. But I told you, I compartmentalize. Canon can both exist and be stupid and ignored at the same time. I think I enraged quite a few members of the Elder Scrolls lore community by appealing to the existence of canon and calling their headcanons fan fiction. But that's because they have a poisoned point of view on what fan fiction is. They attempt to give it a special label as apocrypha to differentiate it from dirty old fan fiction. But here's a little secret. Your headcanon's fine. It's a single-player game and you should play it however you want. But even if it weren't a single-player game, tons of multiplayer RPGs like Neverwinter Nights allow you to create custom homebrew modules. Both the Elder Scrolls and Fallout 3 and 4 ship with construction sets, giving you implicit permission to remake the games how you want. In reality, fan fiction can and often is good, and very often gets repurposed into unique franchises, especially in the literary space. By the way, my favorite fan fiction is the Divine Comedy. A better known part of it is called Dante's Inferno. It's great. It does kinda, sorta, little bit violate canon though. You know, actual religious canon, not the video game stuff nerds argue about. So, moving along. How does this relate to the Fallout TV show? Only that Todd Howard didn't create the Fallout franchise. He might have had massive oversight on the Fallout TV show as executive producer, but he didn't make Fallout 1, 2, Tactics, Brotherhood of Steel, or New Vegas. And nothing about those entries are affected by whatever he chooses to proclaim canon. That's because, contrary to the claims of Fallout being a living franchise, the creative minds that established the earlier entries are no longer involved in the process. Classic Fallout and Bethesda Fallout are two entirely separate beasts, and you know what? That's okay. I appreciated the storytelling of Fallout 1. I think Fallout 2 got a little bit silly, but was otherwise alright. At times, Fallout 2 almost felt like a parody of Fallout 1, but it was still a good game. I didn't like the combat system in either game, though. It's not the turn-based combat I dislike, it's something specific to how Fallout 1 and 2 handle their combat that feels kind of sluggish and unfair, janky in a way I want to avoid. I didn't get that feeling from other isometric RPGs like Baldur's Gate. It's specific to Fallout in a way that I just don't like. It's kind of in the same way I'm not really a huge RTS fan, but I binged the Command & Conquer and Dune series in order to get through their campaigns and get more story. We didn't have YouTube back then. The only way I could get more story was to win. These days, if I don't like a game and want to see the story, we got YouTube and we got Twitch streamers. So I wouldn't say I was a classic Fallout fan, more that I liked classic Fallout more than I disliked it. 50-50, you know? Fallout 3 gave me gameplay I enjoyed, even if the story was one of the dumbest I'd seen in a long time, and I was fairly well taken out of the main quest by the stupidity of both the father character and Colonel Autumn, coupled with my own character's inability to pick dialogue options I would personally agree with. But as most people would tell you, the main quest isn't the main draw of a Bethesda game, except when it is. But for me, it was the first-person dungeon crawling. Every subway tunnel, abandoned building, section of downtown DC ruins, and more were individual dungeons to explore. I loved it. So Fallout 3 was the first Fallout game I wasn't suffering to enjoy in some way. Fast forward to Fallout New Vegas by former Black Isle Studios employees, aka classic Fallout developers, and I got a quality story to complement the style of game I wanted to play. Made by Obsidian, it was more RPG than anything Bethesda had put out, with choices and consequences on how to progress your character through the various factions and quest lines. I would complain about the lack of dungeons in Fallout New Vegas, but the DLCs made up for that by being dungeons unto themselves. Fallout 4 was complicated. It refused to learn proper lessons from Fallout New Vegas, instead fell back on Fallout 3 hard in terms of its writing, and also strayed from Fallout 3 in questionable ways. The game was surreal in the sense that Fallout 3 gave you permission to wander into the wasteland looking for your father, or after meeting him, waiting until the time was right to join him at Project Purity, or after his untimely fate, taking your time to prepare for revenge, or with the DLCs, taking your time in the post-game. Fallout 3 more often than not gave you permission to wander the wasteland at your own pace, similar to Morrowind. Fallout 4, on the other hand, put your character on a leash with the baby, Sean! There's nothing stopping you from physically wandering the wasteland, but from a role-playing perspective, you are a psychopath for allowing your child to stay with your spouse's killer. So, while we very often say Morrowind, Oblivion, Fallout 3, or Skyrim, that you should just turn your brain off and enjoy the sandbox, Fallout 4 was the first time where it really became necessary for me to turn my brain off to enjoy the game. In exchange for turning my brain off for Fallout 4, I got a huge map full of fun little dungeons with much better gameplay than Fallout 3. Don't get me wrong, it's still nowhere near as good as some of my favorite first-person shooters, but at least it's an improvement over Fallout 3. From there, we had Fallout 76, which is a silly game, but the sandbox is 4 times the size of Fallout 4 and has some really cool dungeons to explore. Like, the world and dungeons were actually made by Bethesda Game Studios Maryland, Todd's team, before it was outsourced to Austin and the other Bethesda studios to finish it up. That's why, at least in my opinion, it's kind of the best sandbox in a Bethesda game to date. So as long as you just kind of zen out and explore that massive sandbox, Fallout 4 and 76 are tremendously fun games. The problem is, that's not what classic Fallout fans came to the franchise for. After Fallout 3, the base of classic fans was re-energized with Fallout New Vegas. And a lot of people became very attached to New Vegas. They became very invested in the setting. A setting that created a convincing illusion that the NCR and Legion were these monolithic forces, and that the Fallout world was advancing. Remember when I said, if you don't treat nostalgic material with reverence when you take over intellectual property, that it will be received as cynical, even hateful? That's exactly how a lot of New Vegas fans look at the Fallout TV series, because Fallout New Vegas spoke to them in a way that no Fallout game had in many years. Fallout 4 was a disconnection point from them, and Fallout 76 was a non-consideration. They went nope and didn't partake. For them, Fallout ended at New Vegas, and they were looking for that next serious look into the wasteland. And while I can totally see where they were coming from, since New Vegas is one of my favorites, I also enjoyed Fallouts 3, 4, and 76. I understand what Bethesda Fallout is. It's goofy. It's dumb. It fits right on American TV with the other goofy, dumb American TV shows. It's Borderlands light, with the crass humor turned way down. Lucy is a naive, idealistic lady coming from a dumb Bethesda vault, akin to 101. Her character progression into a less nice person is slow, and I enjoyed it. The Brotherhood of Steel man, Maximus, is a big goof who fails at basically everything he does. He's got ambitions, he just has no comprehension of how to accomplish them, so he fails again and again and again. He is the most human of the characters, and people hate to look at him, hate to see his bumbling, because that is what most people would end up doing in an apocalypse. They would fail. Finally, we have the Ghoul. The Ghoul is the murder hobo. We all do this at least once in Fallout, even if it's just reloading a save real quick afterward. We play the murder hobo. These 3 characters represent different ways to play Bethesda games. Pretty much all the flashbacks in the show are bad, presentation-wise. I don't care to nitpick their lore significance, or even their effectiveness in general storytelling. I'm already of the opinion that modern Bethesda storytelling is bad, so whenever they butcher the lore a little bit more, I've already stopped caring. That said, again, Lucy had a strong character arc, and that's more than I could have hoped for the series. Now, for classic fans, remember that Bethesda Fallout, any semblance of humanity rebuilding needs to be sacrificed on the altar of the aesthetic. The wasteland aesthetic is everything. That's why everyone lives in trash-filled huts despite it being 200 years after the bombs fell. Someone may ask why Fallout New Vegas uses that aesthetic as well. It's because those textures were copy-pasted from Fallout 3. Fallout New Vegas borrowed Bethesda's aesthetic. However, if you go into New Vegas, go into the hotels, some of them are, at least at the entrance levels, much better looking than anything you'll ever find in most Bethesda Fallout. And that's because they tried to make contrast between the wild wasteland outside of New Vegas and the locations under Mr. House's management. So while most of New Vegas uses Bethesda's aesthetic, it doesn't use their storytelling. But the writing of the Fallout TV show is remarkably better than Fallout's 3, 4, or 76. It ascends beyond stupid video game and reaches stupid TV show, with some decent character development. Again, more than I could have hoped. The aesthetic of Bethesda Fallout, by the way, they nailed it. The series is a feast for the eyes, packed full of what Red Letter Media, from like the 3 or 4 videos I've seen of theirs, call member berries. Remember this? Remember that? Of course I do. The sets, the costumes, the props, they nailed all of it. If you're a fan of Fallouts 3, 4, and 76, the show sticks the landing and has the vibe of all those games. It was a delight to just sit there and watch. My wife knows practically nothing about Fallout besides watching me like dungeon crawl a little bit. And she was able to enjoy the series fully from beginning to end. And alongside her, I was able to appreciate the adaptation for what it was. And if you are a Fallout New Vegas fan, remember Dead Money? We obviously all love using a stealth boy with the stealth skill to sneak past Elijah and take the gold out with us while over encumbered. But that's not really what the DLC was supposed to teach us. The point of it was letting go of the gold and getting out of there alive. Something Elijah would fail to do and condemn him to a slow death in the treasure vault beneath the Sierra Madre. In this little discussion, the gold represents the hope for the Fallout franchise becoming on its own what you wish it to be. That Fallout is dead, and what is left behind is a corporate celebration of dumb wasteland fun, with cool callbacks now and again. If you can't embrace it, then it's better for your mental health to just give up the gold, lest you be trapped for the rest of your life. Now that said, I love thought experiments and what-if scenarios. I love homebrew and building up fun alternate possibilities. I'll likely be sharing one of those relating to Fallout New Vegas in the months to come. Again, just for fun. Remember, these developers that gave us software development kits with every game they shipped. This comes with a legal contract allowing us to create our own version of the intellectual property for modding purposes. It's not copyright infringement to make our own fan fiction of Bethesda things. Bethesda has given us a fan content policy about it, which is an implied license. Earlier, when I said Canon was a social contract that the public has generally consented to and that you, the individual, have the freedom to reject it, the developers themselves have given you tacit approval to make up whatever reality you want. If that reality is disregarding the canon of Fallout 3, 4, 76, and the TV show, then you have it. New Vegas isn't going anywhere. As for me, I liked the show in the same way I like Fallout 3, 4, and 76. It's stupid. I'm looking forward to Season 2 potentially being horrible, but it might be good. I think that it's in pretty good hands, provided you don't take it too seriously. Just another dumb American show. But let me ask you, the person watching right now, what franchise made you declare you don't care about canon and won't acknowledge newer material in that canon? For me, it's Frank Herbert's son, the new Dune novels. Now, let's leave Star Trek and Star Wars at home, because those two are obvious. But aside from those two, which was your Nope franchise and entry that made you go nope? Let me know in a comment. Thanks for watching. I'll be rambling about something else pretty soon. I'll see y'all next time. Goodbye, Caesar. Joshua Graham sends his regards.
Death to